From the 1976 earthquake that took 250,000 lives in a single day to the 2004 tsunami that leveled countless coastlines, humanity has endured some truly horrific 24-hour periods. These are the days that remind us just how fleeting life is, and that no matter how bad you think things are, well, they can always be worse, couldn't they? The good news is that thanks to early warning systems, many of the disasters in today's video could be avoided or at least significantly mitigated today. The bad news is that humanity tends to ignore the warning signs until it's too late, raising serious questions about whether our worst days are behind us. What we can really do is try and remember the tragedies, try and learn the lessons taught in blood, and take a proactive approach. The 1976 Tangshan earthquake. Now, when it comes to sheer catastrophic devastation, there are few events as horrific as the 1976 Tangshan earthquake. The event is remembered as not only one of the most destructive natural disasters in China's history, but as one of the worst natural disasters ever. The earthquake struck on the 27th of July in Tangshan, a Chinese city noted for being both an industrial coal mining cornerstone of the country and for being a major railway hub. The earthquake was determined to be of 11 intensity, or extreme, as determined by the modified Mercalli intensity scale. To put that into context, well, the scale only goes as high as 12, and very few earthquakes are ever rated as 10 or above. This in itself would have been enough to make the earthquake a catastrophe, but matters were made considerably worse by the quake occurring at 3:42 a.m., meaning that the majority of residents were inside, fast asleep, and completely caught off guard. To properly understand how severe the devastation was, there have been technically more severe earthquakes recorded, but what really determines the impact isn't the severity of the earthquake itself, but rather its location. In this case, the destructive potential of the Tangshan fault had been drastically underestimated, so the construction of buildings had been allowed directly on the fault line itself. Structures stretched for kilometers alongside the fault line in both directions, which is the equivalent of establishing a city on the banks of a bubbling volcano. More tragic still is that virtually none of the buildings had been given the necessary reinforcement to withstand even a minor earthquake, so an earthquake of this magnitude was nothing short of an absolute worst-case scenario. Estimations are that 85% of the buildings within the 140-kilometer zone of the epicenter collapsed within minutes of the earthquake striking, with similar casualty rates for all highways and for most of the extensive network of rail bridges. Beyond the primary 140-kilometer zone, the impact was still considered a 6 on the intensity scale, with 10% of buildings collapsing and major services severed, including water and electricity, leaving critical rescue services dramatically hindered. Looking at the primary earthquake, it was measured to be 7.6 magnitude according to the Chinese surface magnitude scales, with shockwaves traveling along the fault for hundreds of kilometers in both directions. The epicenter is estimated to have been around 12 kilometers beneath the southern district of Tangshan, relatively shallow as far as earthquakes are concerned, which resulted in fault surface displacement of around 3 meters. This, by extension, manifested in severe surface rupturing for around 8 kilometers directly through Tangshan city. Looking at specific incidents, we mentioned that Tangshan is an industrial city with a focus on coal mining, and at the time the disaster struck, around 10,000 miners were underground. The quake cut critical electricity supply, meaning that there was no illumination, no ventilation, no working lifts, and all water pumps were rendered inoperable. The lack of water pumps in particular was a serious problem, given that the concrete liners keeping out groundwater were ruptured. Multiple mine shafts were subsequently flooded, creating an absolute nightmare situation. Despite all of this, reports are that miraculously most of the miners escaped with their lives, though some were trapped underground for as long as 2 weeks. It took nearly a year and a half for mining operations to recover. Meanwhile, the railroads running through Tangshan were likewise completely unprepared for an earthquake, with rails running for several kilometers along loose clay and sandy surfaces, many of which immediately collapsed. At the time of the quake, 28 freight trains and 7 passenger trains were traveling through the area, resulting in 7 freights and 2 passenger trains derailing. 43,000 emergency workers were mobilized to assist with the devastation, though they were heavily impaired by the lack of electricity and access to emergency equipment. As tragic as all of this was, if you know anything about earthquakes, you'll know that while the main event is devastating in itself, it's the aftershocks that often take the most lives. In the case of the Tangshan earthquake, there was a long sequence of several aftershocks, each almost as powerful as the first. An initial aftershock struck just 3.5 hours after the main event, measuring a 6 magnitude. Another struck the afternoon of the primary quake, measuring between 7 and 7.4, focused on the northeastern end of the fault. Severe aftershocks continued for months following and have been felt as recently as 2012, 20 2016 and the most recent in 2020, some of which were powerful enough to be felt in Mongolia and Korea. In total, the official death toll of the Tangshan earthquake comes in at around 148,000 in Tangshan city, plus 104,000 severely injured, as well as 69,000 deaths in the Tangshan prefecture, plus nearly 64,000 seriously injured. Today, Tangshan is recognized as a leader in earthquake safety standards, with the extensive reconstruction having adopted the highest level of earthquake-resistant architecture in the world. The 1970 Bhola Cyclone. From one of the worst earthquakes in history to one of the worst tropical cyclones, we have the 1970 Bhola Cyclone, otherwise known as the Great Cyclone. It goes without saying, but this is an event known as one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recorded history, ultimately leading to serious political upheaval and a rapid change in government. The cyclone originated on November the 1st, referred to as Tropical Storm Nora, over the South China Sea. The storm remained in position for a few days, degenerated into a remnant low, much less of a concern than a cyclone, and moved to the Gulf of Thailand on the 4th. At this point, the storm had more or less been written off, but as we'll soon see, the climate is anything but predictable, and the worst tends to happen with virtually no warning. The remnant low contributed to a new atmospheric depression in the Bay of Bengal on November the 8th, and the low point of pressure began drawing in air, translating to a gradual intensification of what had already been downgraded to a minor concern. At about this time, the storm also began to crawl gradually northward. The India Meteorological Department upgraded the storm to a cyclone, and even as the severity continued to intensify, the eastern Pakistan coastline on November the 12th was hit with 3-minute sustained winds of 185 kilometers an hour and 1-minute sustained winds of 240 kilometers an hour. At this point, you're probably thinking that at least the people of Pakistan had plenty of time to prepare, but sadly, we now have to go into why there had been almost no preparation of any kind. Reports reveal that there had been a serious breakdown of communication across the board, partly due to political friction and partly due to just plain old incompetence. It's been widely suggested that Indian weather authorities were well aware of the storm, but may not have shared this critical information with East Pakistani weather authorities. Furthermore, the warnings issued by the Pakistan Meteorological Department had been done so incorrectly, with the most vulnerable coastal regions receiving the message as a great danger signal as opposed to a number 1, which was the accepted terminology. Hence, when the storm hit, citizens had done virtually nothing to prepare, leading to a disaster that shook the region to its core. The exact death toll is unknown, but the Tangshan earthquake and Bhola cyclone are often listed side by side, with fatalities generally thought to be comparable. In the case of the Bhola cyclone, however, there is a lack of solid information, with fatalities potentially being as high as between 300 and 500,000. A meteorological station at Chittagong, 95 kilometers east of where the storm made landfall, recorded winds of 144 kilometers an hour before the anemometer was ripped off. A ship anchored in the same area recorded peak gusts of 220 kilometers an hour at roughly the same time as a 10-meter storm surge rampaged through the Ganges Delta and up towards the largest and busiest port in Bangladesh. Several seagoing vessels were severely damaged, and the local airports were under at least a meter of water for several hours. The worst to be hit were undoubtedly Bhola Island and Hatia Island, located off the coast. Bhola Island was all but entirely destroyed, rice crops wiped out, countless structures leveled, and it's estimated that a horrific 45% of the 167,000 population of the Tasmuddin district were killed, which translates to 14% of the entire island. Of those that did survive, many were affected by a phenomenon that became known as cyclone syndrome, referring to severe lacerations of the limbs and chest, self-inflicted as survivors clung to trees to avoid being swept away. Across all impacted coastlines, it's estimated that 3.6 million were left homeless, with total damages coming in at a staggering $701 million. Reports say that 85% of homes on the coastline were destroyed, 9,000 offshore fishing boats were rendered useless, and 46,000 fishermen were killed of the 77,000 that lived on the coastline. This in turn resulted in approximately 65% of all fishing capacity being hamstrung, an especially dire situation given only people relied on fish for their daily meals. Add to this, an estimated 280,000 cattle were lost, and the long-term devastation just can't be overstated. A month after the storm, over 150,000 in the area were relying on relief aid for at least half of the food required to stave off malnutrition. The 1970 Bhola cyclone itself was an unimaginable tragedy, but the months that followed the devastation brought even more chaos, albeit of the political kind. As residents attempted to rebuild their lives, severe political upheaval erupted, the full extent of which we won't go into in today's video. But the short version is that East Pakistani political leaders were heavily critical of relief efforts, citing gross negligence combined with callous indifference. In the general elections that followed soon after the disaster in December, and due to the boycotting of leftist parties parties in both East and West Pakistan, the Awami League won in a landslide victory. These events ultimately culminated in another tragedy, also best left for a different video. Today, the government of Bangladesh, along with the Bangladesh Red Crescent Society, rely on the Cyclone Preparedness Program established in 1973. The program consists of 76,000 community volunteers across 3,801 villages, focusing primarily on early warning systems, but also capable of rapid mass evacuations. 2004 Sumatra Andaman earthquake. The 2004 Sumatra Andaman earthquake was responsible for the worst tsunami disaster in history and one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 21st century, often referred to as the Boxing Day tsunami. The earthquake that triggered the event occurred off the west coast of Aceh in northern Sumatra, Indonesia, on the 26th of December 2004. A rupturing of the fault between the Burma and Indian plates was the catalyst, and the resulting earthquake ranks among the top 3 ever recorded, well above the Tangshan quake mentioned earlier. Initial reports put the magnitude at an 8.8, but this was later revised by the United States Geological Survey to around 9.3. For context, the event was so severe that the entire planet vibrated by as much as 10 millimeters. The fault line ruptured along a 1,200-kilometer stretch, additional earthquakes were triggered as far away as Alaska, and the reverberations were measurable for up to a week after the original event. Residents felt the shaking in Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives, but in this case, the epicenter was around 160 kilometers off the western coast of North Sumatra. It wasn't the quake itself that caused widespread devastation, but rather what followed shortly after. Now, the death tolls of the Bhola Cyclone and Tangshan earthquake were primarily due to a failure of early warning systems, which left populations completely unprepared. But the Boxing Day tsunami occurred in 2004, so surely some sort of early warning system must have been present, right? Well, sadly, no. Even in 2004, and even with the tsunami taking hours to reach land in some cases, there was still virtually no warning, and populations were again completely unprepared. There was, simply put, no tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean even in 2004, with the argument being that there hadn't been a major tsunami on that side of the world since the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa. Additionally, even when offshore earthquakes do occur, there is no guarantee that they will cause a tsunami, as was the case with a similar 8.7 magnitude quake in March 2005. So although the 2004 earthquake had been detected, no subsequent tsunami warning followed, given that a correlation had not yet been established. On the other hand, there were very clear early warning signs on multiple coastlines, with residents in Aceh, Phuket, Khao Lak, and Penang witnessing an incredibly unusual occurrence: the ocean receding dramatically, exposing the seabed beneath. Sadly, in most cases, the phenomenon wasn't recognized for what it was, and it's reported that many residents even went to the beach to witness the bizarre event firsthand, but guaranteeing their deaths. In only a few cases, the warning signs were recognized, including one incident on the Mai Khao beach in Phuket City, where a 10-year-old British tourist, Tilly Smith, had recently studied tsunamis in geography class. Thanks to her recognizing the telltale signs, she and her parents successfully evacuated the beach. Meanwhile, on the Indonesian island of Sumulu, the local folklore spoke of such warning signs, with the information having been passed down verbally following a similar earthquake and tsunami that occurred in 1907. The islanders fled to the hills after the earthquake, and after the ocean receded, they came back down, most having survived. In all other cases, residents were not so lucky, with the worst hit being Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, India, the Maldives, Myanmar, Somalia, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. There is no definitive number of lives lost in the first 24-hour period, but estimates put the total at between 220 to as high as 300,000. Properly summing up the full extent of the chaos and destruction across multiple coastal cities is almost impossible, but eyewitness accounts from Aceh, the closest major city, give some idea of what was experienced. Aceh locals reported first witnessing the ocean receding and exposing the seabed, prompting some to venture out and start collecting stranded fish. This was followed by a first wave which rose gently to the foundations of coastal buildings, and assumptions were that this harmless wave would be the extent of it. But what followed was described as a 12-meter-high black giant, a mountain, a wall of water, surging into the city and sweeping away entire buildings. One report indicates that the water level was as high as the second-story windows of residential buildings, 3.2 kilometers inland, with the water still showing no signs of dissipating. Another horrific account describes that in the seaside section of Uli Luhu, the streets were flooded with a 6-meter surge that had carried debris and bodies for 40 kilometers from other distant coastal areas. In an incident that has now become legend, an electric generator barge weighing 2,600 tons was carried nearly 3 kilometers inland and dumped, destroying 2 houses and killing the residents. After the devastation subsided, rather an attempt to remove or dismantle the barge, it was secured and designated a tourist attraction, now referred to as the Museum PLT Diapung. Needless to say, the area of the city facing the Indian Ocean was all but entirely leveled, with the 12-meter-high, 3 to 4 kilometer-long tsunami essentially acting as an eraser. The total cost in damages to all affected countries came in a staggering $10.75 billion, and those displaced numbered 1.7 million. The worldwide humanitarian response raised $14 billion in 2004, equating to around $23 billion in 2025. The United Nations established the Indian Ocean Tsunami Warning Mitigation System in 2005, which is operational today. 1945 bombing of Tokyo. When talking about singularly destructive wartime events, most default to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but there is another often overlooked event that may have been considerably worse, at least looking at it from a 24-hour perspective. Now, we certainly aren't trying to diminish the atomic bomb catastrophes and are aware that the fallout was much worse in the long term, but for most devastating 24-hour periods, the 1945 bombing of Tokyo by the United States Air Force was arguably more destructive. The bombing raid took place in March 1945 and marked a deliberate change in tactics by the USAAF. Up until that point, the Air Force had focused on precision airstrikes against key enemy targets, primarily industrial facilities and military compounds. But those raids had proven largely unsuccessful, requiring that bombers make visual contact with targets before dropping bombs. This meant daytime missions, which were, for obvious reasons, significantly more dangerous, with pilots forced to take the worst of established air defenses. To counter the danger of air defenses, pilots flew at high altitudes, mitigating some of the threat. By extension, high altitudes also meant the bombs were scattered by the wind and often completely missed intended targets, making the missions costly both in terms of military resources and soldiers' lives. The decision was therefore made to instead focus on much broader, more destructive bombing raids against entire populated areas. In contrast to the precision-oriented daytime missions, pilots would instead fly at night, maintain low altitudes, and, as opposed to focusing on singular high-value targets, were instead free to engage entire populated areas. In 1945, the target had been the entire city of Tokyo itself, and 279 Boeing B-29 superfortresses obliterated eastern Tokyo in the most destructive air raid in human history. Now, there is a broader conversation here about the morality of directly targeting citizens, but we won't be going into that right now. What we will say is that the US is far from the only country to greenlight such attacks, and in fact, Japan itself had conducted many similar attacks on Chinese cities throughout World War II, rarely ever even attempting precision attacks. Chongqing, in particular, China's provincial capital, was all but entirely destroyed by Japanese air raids before the end of the war. In fact, the last 10 months of World War II saw an increase in area attacks across the board, with virtually all involved countries shifting from precision targeting to area bombing. In the last 10 months of the war, the bombing accounted for roughly half of all American attacks on Germany, including major operations conducted in Berlin and Dresden, with about 14% of all bombs dropped over that period being incendiary. Similarly, British Bomber Command focused on destroying German cities from as early as 1942 until the end of the war, with incendiary explosives accounting for roughly 21% of all bombs dropped. But speaking of area attacks, what exactly is the difference between incendiary bombs and precision bombs? The M69 incendiaries dropped on Tokyo consisted of a system that sprayed napalm in a general area and then ignited it. M69s were most effective when dropped in clusters, with the intention being to start as many uncontrollable fires as possible in as short a period as possible. As opposed to destroying key military facilities, the idea was to simply terrorize a population and cause widespread destruction, crippling a country's economy and, by extension, crippling its military efforts. In the case of the Tokyo attack, after first targeting a military compound, pilots were ordered to switch to the Tokyo districts deemed to be the most flammable, namely those consisting of structures made of bamboo. Estimates are that 330,000 M69 incendiaries were dropped on an area of 41 square kilometers, transforming it instantly into an inferno. The operation was deemed an enormous success, and the blazing firestorms are speculated to have destroyed an estimated 267,171 Japanese buildings, leaving over 1 million homeless and over 100,000 killed in a 24-hour period. On the other side of the equation, Japanese air defenses were almost completely helpless in resisting the attack. Approximately 638 anti-aircraft guns were involved, along with 90 counterfighter aircraft, but even combined, these forces were easily overcome. The Japanese 1st Anti-Aircraft Division and 10th Air Division were expecting and were trained for high-altitude planes conducting daytime attacks. Low-flying planes at nighttime were nothing short of an unstoppable curveball, and Japanese defenses managed to shoot down only 14 bombers and damage an additional 42, accounting to just 96 USAAF aircrew fatalities. 30 minutes after the bombing started, the Tokyo Fire Department was losing control of the situation. After an hour, attempts to fight the fire were abandoned, and efforts instead turned to guiding civilians to safety and rescuing those trapped in burning buildings. By the end, 125 firemen and 500 civil guards lost their lives, along with 96 fire engines that were completely destroyed. It took Tokyo an estimated 2 decades to fully recover from the event, though some districts still show sign of the devastation to this day. The 1945 bombing of Tokyo is remembered at 2 official memorials, several neighborhood memorials, and at the privately owned Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage. 1916 Battle of the Somme. When it comes to wartime casualties suffered in a single day relating to direct soldier conflicts, there are many battles to take into account and many depressing lists of fatality numbers to comb through. One of the worst conflicts, with perhaps the highest casualty numbers in a 24-hour period, is the first day of the 1916 Battle of the Somme, fought between the British Empire and the French Republic versus the German Empire. If there is a conflict with higher casualties in 24-hour period that we've missed, well, let us know in the comments. We don't think so. The Battle of the Somme took place between the 1st of July and the 18th of November, and in total more than 3 million men fought, and to this day, the battle is considered one of the costliest in human history. Now, we're not going to go into the deeper details of World War I today, but the nutshell version of this particular battle is that at the Chantilly Conference in December 1915, the Allies agreed upon a combined offensive which included France, Russia, Britain, and Italy, with the Somme offensive in particular being undertook by a united Franco-British army. The initial plan was that the more robust French forces would handle the central offensive, supported by the British, who only had limited armies in the area at the time. But the agreed-upon plan was thrown into turmoil when the Imperial German Army attacked France, triggering the Battle of Verdun. As a result, French divisions intended for Somme were diverted, and a rapid restructuring was forced. The best possible compromise saw the far less capable British armies assigned to the principal effort of the Somme conflict, and the outcome was one of the worst single days ever recorded for a ground offensive. To properly understand why it all went so wrong, the British Expeditionary Force sent by Britain to support France already had a long and complicated story prior to this, but most relevant to our story is that the army had been reinforced, having already fought multiple battles and suffered serious casualties. As such, numbers had been bolstered by the Territorial Force and Kitchener's army, both of which were almost entirely made up of volunteers. The Territorial Force came about due to the Territorial and Reserve Forces Act of 1907, which aimed to bolster soldier numbers without resorting to conscription. Kitchener's army, otherwise dismissively referred to as Kitchener's Mob, was likewise made up of volunteers, and as the nickname suggested, the army was considered not to be particularly effective as a military force. Adding to the dilemma was a rapid recent expansion of the British military across the board, which had created not only an acute equipment shortage, but a massive number of vacancies for senior military commanders and specialist positions. In a desperate attempt to create some sort of operational structure, many retired officers were called back into battle, but were accompanied by a wave of inexperienced newcomers, none of which were fit to hold senior positions. Douglas Haig, who had previously been a lieutenant general in command of 1st Corps, was promoted to command the 1st Army in early 1915 and was then quickly moved on to command the British Expeditionary Force by December of the same year. By the time he took command, the BEF had ballooned to 5 armies and 60 divisions, with reports saying that so few of the newcomer senior officers were competent that Haig simply gave commands direct to soldiers, since he wanted to avoid mistakes made by incapable subordinates. It was under these circumstances that the British headed to Somme to do battle, but unfortunately, this isn't the worst of it. 2016 saw the 100th anniversary of the battle, and as part of the remembrance, hundreds of soldiers' letters were published, forgotten interviews were released, and other crucial information came to light. It was this new information that revealed 2 disgruntled soldiers betrayed Allied plans to German interrogators weeks prior to the battle, giving Germany plenty of time to prepare defenses for the attack. The new defenses included an impeccably organized series of artillery barrage sectors, as well as deeply entrenched communication lines dug 6 feet deep and running for 8 kilometers to the artillery batteries. The German defences did have weaknesses, such as the front trenches being on forward-facing slopes, but Germany still had an overwhelming advantage on the first day, and the inexperienced British soldiers took the full brunt. The Battle of Albert was the first phase of the Battle of the Somme, taking place between the 1st and 13th of July. You might be surprised to hear that the first day was largely a success for the attacking Franco-British forces, but this unfortunately doesn't include the primary British offensive. Predictably, the attacking British soldiers were all but entirely devastated. The Allies had conducted preparatory artillery bombardments leading up to the offensive, starting on the 24th of June, with the push following on the 1st of July. The French 6th Army and right wing of the British 4th Army managed a resounding defeat against the German 2nd Army, achieving what was reported as complete success. The primary British attack, on the other hand, failed across the board, with it reported that there were close to 60,000 British casualties in a single day. Several truces were agreed on, so the mountains of dead and dying British soldiers in the no man's land could be recovered. British losses in the first 24 hours of the battle were, simply put, unprecedented, and even now, the first day of the Battle of the Somme is the single worst defeat in the entire history of the British Army. In comparison, the French 6th Army suffered just 1,590 casualties, and the German 2nd Army between 10 and 12,000, bringing the total casualties in a single day to around 75,000. The Battle of the Somme continued for an additional 3 more phases, amounting to 12 significant battles, with the last, the Battle of Ancre, occurring between the 13th and the 18th of November. Over the course of the entire battle, total casualties came to around 1 million, including 419,654 British, 200,000 French, and 450,000 German. Thank you for watching.